I wanted to just point out a few things. It's okay to decay. We're going to be looking at some images of that are related to the Memento Mori. It's something that was much more famous in the Middle Ages, Renaissance, but I'm going to be getting just to a few of those and then getting more contemporary. And I'd like to invite your input on some of the images as well. I love this quote by Andy Warhol, "I'm not afraid to die, I just don't want to be there when it happens." So with that in mind, so this is a traditional rendering of Memento Mori, a skull, and there's a lovely snake coming through his head, and you see a little creature in the pit of his, abdominal cavity there. So this is an engraving from a Netherlandish master. We're not quite sure of his identity. So this is typical of this time period, just trying to sort of set this idea up that, remember that you will die, consider that perhaps, life is fleeting. Remember, this is also the time of the plagues, and so the plagues, it's hard for us to really understand the impact that the plagues had on Europe, because it isn't that, we're seeing anything that would have decimated the population to that extent. But the plagues, of course, had different waves attributed to them, ultimately decimating a third of Europe's population, and some parts of Italy, which we'll see next, they 4/5 of the population in Florence. In fact, this is what I think, I've done a lot of work on this image. This is a fresco from Santa Maria Novella in Florence. So this is Masaccio's Holy Trinity. So here is the Trinity here, the God the Father, the Holy Spirit connecting the Son on the cross, Mary, John, and these are the donors. The thing that is revolutionary about this is that he was only about 26, maybe 27 when he did this, and died the following year. In mysterious circumstances, actually. They're not really quite sure how he died so young. There's theories that maybe he was killed by a jealous, somebody who was jealous of his genius. I have wondered if he maybe himself was a victim of the plague. It's possible his father was a victim of the plague. What you see going on is he actually was friends with Filippo Brunelleschi, who designed the dome on the famous Duomo in Florence that no one else could figure out how to finish. The Duomo in Florence stood without a dome on top for 100 years until they found someone who could figure it out. And Brunelleschi figured it out. He also figured out one-point perspective, mathematical one-point perspective, and Masaccio captures this in absolutely glorious detail. And you can see it's huge. If you've never seen it in person, make sure if you're in Florence that you see it, because it's really quite striking in person. But down at the bottom is a Memento Mori. There have been, in fact, just about every art historian I consulted when I did a chapter on my book on this said that this was the skeleton of Adam. And so the idea was that this was somehow to remind Christians that the sacrifice of Jesus was to make up for the death of, or the sin of Adam, which I don't buy at all, actually. I have disputed this. I think that what he's doing here, because he's doing something really revolutionary here, is he's placing God within human achievement. So he's making a statement about how somehow the greatest adventures of humanity are somehow also part of the divine, and that in the midst of all the suffering going on in Florence between famine and war and the plague, that somehow God is still within that mausoleum, so to speak. And so what's noticeable here is that it's not a Latin inscription, it's an Italian, which is very unusual. And what this inscription says, what you are, I once was, what I am, you will be. And so to me, that's much more reminiscent of a Memento Mori. I've theorized that this is a plague victim. And so he's He's thinking of that whole catastrophe of the plague while he's doing this. This, to come up to the more present day, this is Sarah Lucas's self-portrait with skull. This is actually a digital photograph which she has in a print. And I really thought that this was striking. She does this whole series of self-portraits. These are at the Tate in London. And this is obviously a contemplation of death, but there's also something else going on in terms of the placement of the skull. What do you make of that? Any takers? What do you think she's saying by placing the skull where she does? Because she's contemplating death, but she's also contemplating something else. Birth, right? So the female body is not only the way that we are born into the world, but because we're born, we die. So we're the reasons that people now are not only born, but that they die as well. She's also making another comment about the female body in terms of the placement. She's thinking a little bit Freudian, maybe. Do I have to spell it out? So we're thinking of, that connection between the erotic and death, that there is a definite connection going on there. The thing that I think is interesting about her portrait series, and she does a whole series, she kind of plays with gender. She plays with androgyny. She plays with tough female countenance, right? So she's got sort of, an androgynous look. She's kind of playing with masculinity. She's playing with femininity. She's playing with ideas of death. She's playing with ideas of sex, birth, all of that, just by how she's placed the skull. Any other thoughts on this one? I was thinking of Nietzsche. I think of Nietzsche a lot. And so basically, in Thus Spoke Zarathustra, he has a chapter on free death. And Zarathustra says this: I want to become earth again, that I may have peace in her who bore me. Nietzsche was thinking that we need to rethink death. We need to rethink death as a part of life, as something natural to the cycles of life, and not something so final. And I think that there's something here that she does. This is Vincent van Gogh's skull with a burning cigarette. When my husband first saw this, he said, I bet they added that cigarette later. I said, nope, that's Van Gogh. He was an avid smoker, so it's not an anti-smoking campaign. It's not that at all. So he was playing again. He's playing. This is what I love about how some artists have interpreted Memento Mori. They've done this playfully. They've thought about this as something, let's just laugh in the face of death. And this is why I also put the quote from Nietzsche, Der Tod ist umzudeuten. Let's reinterpret death. And so here you have one of his earlier works. He was making fun of the academy using skeletons to substitute for using live models. So he's saying, okay, here you go. He thought that was sort of ridiculous. So when he was studying at the academy, he said, this is kind of ridiculous. So that's what comes of that. Any thoughts on this one? I love this. I think this is great. This is just, and he was sickly at the time. So he's thinking about his mortality a lot. This is Paul Klee's Death and Fire. So whereas the Van Gogh was toward the beginning of his career, this is toward the end of Klee's career. Calloway actually dies in the year 1940. He dies in June of 1940, I think. And so basically this must have been fairly close to when he actually dies. And so you see the German word death is here in the painting. So here's the skull, and here is the arm, so to speak, and the hand holding up a golden orb. So you see T-O-D, death. Yeah.
It's in the face too.
It's in the face too, right? Yeah. So basically, the thing that I love about this, I love Clay, and I think what he's doing is something, he's thinking about his death. He suffered for years from scleroderma, which causes skin problems, difficulty swallowing, all sorts of condition. So he's been thinking about mortality for a while. And here he reduces it to something almost like a cave painting. He was also fascinated at the time with hieroglyphics. And so there's this sense in which there's something that is so inescapable about being human, about facing one's death. But he also puts the whole thing on fire. Any thoughts as to why he does that one? Puts death and fire together.
Well, cremation, perhaps, right?
It could be cremation. Being swallowed up by fire.
Or hellfire.
Hellfire? I don't think he was thinking
Yeah,
that.
I was hoping not.
Yeah, I don't think that's what he's doing.
It does jump to mind.
Or maybe he's hoping that maybe there will be a liberation about death and that there's some sort of ethereal thing going on. I don't know. I mean, it's one of those things that, it's a very enigmatic work. Compositionally, it's very striking. Any other thoughts? And then Damien Hirst's For the Love of God. This actually comes, the title of this comes from his mother. Damien Hirst, if you don't know, is an artist who does a lot of, like the shark and the formaldehyde. That was him. And if you've seen, you'd know Damien Hirst if you saw it, that if you're going into a museum in Oslo, they're in the Contemporary Museum in Oslo, you walk through a mother cow who's sliced in half, and you walk through her calf who's sliced in half. And so he's thinking of death all the time as well. And so when he's famous for this, he makes a fortune reputation, and his mother says, for the love of God, what are you going to do next? And this is it. So this is what he follows up on. You can see that it's from the description. He bought a skull. I think it's an 18th century skull, and he cast it in platinum. So it's cast in platinum, and then 8,600 flawless diamonds with a 52.4 carat pink diamond at the front of the cranium. So it's 1,106 carats total. This thing is worth a fortune, but he inset it with the original skull's teeth. So those are the real teeth. So the thing about this one, this is a tough one for me because diamonds have a fraught history, right? In terms of having to do with despicable labor practices. Might have heard of the blood diamond problem in Africa. And so this is kind of a problem. He financed this. So he spent $28 million of his own money to put this together. And obviously there's a sense in which, he's laughing at us. He's laughing at the art world. He's laughing at us looking at this and being dazzled by it. And it's death laughing, because it's something that obviously this will never end up in a dustbin. This will always be something that will be considered an object of beauty and glory and so forth. But of course we can't help but think that he should ask himself, what has he done? And so I think about Salgado's series on the gold mines in Brazil and the labor practices in getting gold. There's a whole series that the Brazilian photographer did for this. The labor practices are horrific to get precious objects. And then this is Santiago Sierra. This is something where he was thinking in terms of performance. So this is something of a performance piece that's also a photograph. So what he did was he paid these men $30 each to tattoo a line on their back. And because in Cuba they're so poor, they agreed to do this. And so he's making statements about the nature of labor practice, about the nature of capitalism, about what we do to people, what people are willing to do in order to get by. And so to me, it's hard to think about the Damien Hirst piece without thinking about how we come to acquire a certain standard of living in European American culture, and then of course how who are the people who are laboring to apply that standard to our culture. Any thoughts on these pieces? I can go back to the Hearst as well if anyone wanted to see that one again. It is dazzling. It's pretty spectacular. It's just hard. I think it's one of those things. I think Damien Hirst himself, when he started to think about the blood diamond problem, he started to think, maybe I should think like Robert Oppenheimer, creator of the atomic bomb, what have I done? And so, but he also said that, think about the markup on paint and canvas. How many canvases sell for well into the hundreds of millions of dollars? And he said, at least this really is worth that in terms of precious gems. This is Archibald Motley, who is an artist who was born in New Orleans. His father was the son of slaves. He has Creole descent, and he is famous for participating in the Harlem Renaissance and the Jazz Age. So he chronicles African American life from different sort of joyous and musically based aspects. But this he considered his masterpiece. It took him 10 years to complete this. But LACMA in the 1970s would not include this in a collection when they did a retrospective on African American artists because they thought it was too, well, it's pretty telling.
Too honest.
Too honest, there you go. And so the title is long, the first 100 years, meaning 100 years since the Emancipation Proclamation, because he started this in 63. He amongst you who is without sin shall cast the first stone. Forgive them, Father, for they know not what they do. And just to point out, I'm not sure if the podium is in the way. He juxtaposes a skull with an African mask here in the corner. We have a lynching here in the center. Martin Luther King, John F. Kennedy. Trying to see if I got everything in terms of, here's Abraham Lincoln. So he has colored only America for whites, Africa for blacks with the swastika, whites only. We see there's these touches of red that juxtapose against the blue that really make the painting striking. I saw this at the Broad just about a month ago, I think it was, when we were there. The Broad, I mean, and so basically it was so amazing to see this in person. It's quite large, but the blue is so beautiful, and then the red just sort of stands out even more. But you see the devil here, obviously the Confederate flag, the symbol on the Ku Klux Klan, burning cross, the firemen. It's really extraordinary. And again, this was the last painting he ever did. 9 years later, he puts his brushes down after he's done with this. 9 years later, doesn't paint anything else and dies 9 years later. Any thoughts here? So kind of the house falling apart of American history and American society.
The first thing that strikes me is that it's a winter scene.
Mm-hmm.
Winter. That's the first thing I think when I see it.
Like the winter is coming.
Winter is here.
Winter is here. It's like a haunted house. I mean, to juxtapose the lynching with the Statue of Liberty. Genius.
And like the Statue of Liberty almost like blends in with the background, and like you could faintly see like the outline or like the flame.
Yeah.
Is the Statue of Liberty hanging also? I can't quite.
No, I think it's on the pedestal.
Okay.
So here we, the tree, snake. There's a lot of religious symbolism. He was actually a practicing Catholic. Probably comes from his Creole and New Orleans heritage. But he lived a good deal of his life in Bronzeville and Chicago. and chronicles a lot of Chicago history.
There's a bullet hole in that stained glass window,
Yeah.
is there? I can't quite see the figures inside.
Yeah.
Can you tell us about those a bit?
I don't know too much about this. It looks to me, it looks like the story of Jesus, suffer the children to come to me, and the bullet hole, it looks like this is a sitting figure of Jesus and then the children all coming to him, but the bullet hole goes through, so you don't see the face of Jesus. Yeah, it's a tough painting to look at, but I agree with him. I think this is his masterpiece.
You could also see like the 3 crosses like to the left of like the.
Yeah, good. Yeah, yeah. And then to kind of continue on that trajectory of thinking about death and race, especially in the context of a 28-year-old African-American woman who was shot in her house in front of her 8-year-old nephew this Saturday. This is Basquiat. You might know him. Also died very young, like Masaccio dies. He's about, 27, 28 when he dies of a heroin overdose. He was also extraordinary for doing as much as he was able to do before his death, considering that most of his adult life he was homeless, he slept on friends' couches. But this is such a set of contrasts. So we have, obviously, there's a rendering of death and the yellow teeth and the grimace, but there's also something of, kind of a stitched together identity that he probably was thinking of, since he was both Haitian and Puerto Rican in heritage, and obviously trying to find his way on the streets of New York. Any thoughts here? This is also, there's a Basquiat display at the Broad that you might want to check out. But the graffiti, that was something he was famous for, incorporating graffiti elements into his work. But just sort of the way that the eyes are staring. I mean, it's a skull, but there's eyes that are staring. You don't usually see that. So what you might make of that. Here's another one. This one's a little more hard to look at in a sense. It's more of sort of like Monk's The Scream, there's a scream going on, so it's more of an unsettling rendering, in as far as I can tell.
Looks like the head might even be injured too.
Might be injured? Is that what you're
That's the
saying?
impression I get from looking at it. There might be a blow to the head or something.
Yeah. It could also be a commentary on, you see he's got these mathematical scrawls on the top. There might be something going on there too with thinking about the calculus of violence that he is, witnessing as a young black man in the streets of New York. There's a sense in which, this sort of, he's also, at the time, these are some of his canvases. He was doing a lot of drawings before this, and it's possible that he's getting more famous when these are coming out, and he's dealing with the question of identity and who is he now that he's become more famous. Any other idea? Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, I see like a little bit of confusion, especially with the colors, like the light and the dark, and that makes sense about the identity. It's just kind of like confused.
Yeah, I think that's it. I mean, he's working through his heritage, he's working through what fame means, he's working through, and in terms of fame, he was friends with Andy Warhol. And they did actually some collaborations together. And I thought I'd end with this one because we started with a little Andy Warhol. Andy Warhol also faithful Byzantine Catholic, and he did this. This is 76, so it's about 10 years before he dies, and it's something that is about 10 years after he was shot and almost dies. And so he found this skull, I think it was in London that he found it, and had it photographed. And off the end comes this shadow. It almost looks like the head of a fetus that is coming off of it. So I thought that that was kind of interesting. And these canvases that he did are really quite large. So this does not contain the repetition that Warhol is known for, but this is something that, you know, places the skull right in the middle. Creating the series of works, he wrote, "The skull is the classic still life, only there won't be anything else. There will just be this big skull, and it's everybody's portrait in the world." So I thought we'd leave it at that. This is our portrait. Thank you.
Good afternoon. My name is Jamall Calloway. I'm in the Theology and Religious Studies department, and I do liberation theology, philosophy of religion, literature. This will primarily focus on literature by way of theater. And I don't really get to present on theater, so I'm kind of excited about this. So, how many have seen Our Town or read Our Town?
Saw it here.
Saw it here. This is actually from USD. This is the program from the Shiley Graduate Theater program here. I believe it was last year that there was a sort of, anyone ever play in Our Town? Anyone was ever Emily? Or you did? I know to ask that question. Who were you? You were Emily. Good, good. For those who have not seen it, I hope to explain it through the sort of lecture. First, let me begin with a little background for those who are unfamiliar with the play. Let me say that there are two beginnings to the play. The first beginning of the play is not a beginning. For the play begins with our lives, with our consciousness, our experiences, and our memories. That's why the first sentence, if you have the actual text, the first sentence says, "No curtain, no scenery. The audience arriving sees an empty stage in half light." So for those who were to see the play live, when you walk in, this is sort of all you see. Sort of dim lights, you see chairs, and sometimes you'll have the stage manager, and I'll get into the stage manager in a second. Stage manager will be sort of sitting in the corner, just sort of watching everyone as they sort of walk in. Our Town is kind of about two families who live next door to each other, the Gibbs and the Webbs. Most important to remember is Emily Webb and George Gibbs. In this play, you'll see, I think there are these two in this particular play right here. So this play has 3 acts. The first act is entitled Daily Life. The second act is entitled Love and Marriage. So Emily and George get married in the second act. And the third act is untitled, but Wilder says the third act is about death and eternity. In Act 1, the audience gets to know the characters and all of their insignificance. Wilder focuses on what he considers to be universal human experiences through each act. By centralizing 2 families in every act, the Gibbs and the Webbs, the audience or reader sees an archetypal American family meant to replicate themselves. Thus, the family specificity is not meant to assert any uniqueness. They are simply an American family or American families. There's nothing particularly special about these people on screen. There's nothing unique about them. But secondly, in Act 1, the audience or the readers are informed about each character's death. So all of these people right here throughout the play, you find out in the beginning, Act 1, how they died, why they died, at what point in time, and how are their deaths affected by each other. So you have 11-year-old Joe Kroll Jr. who delivers newspapers in the community, and we learn through this stage manager that I was talking about, he dies in the First War. Early in the play, we also learn from the stage manager, and the stage manager is this manager who just informs everyone about what happens. We understand that Dr. Gibbs, he dies after his wife, Mrs. Gibbs, who dies while visiting their future son-in-law and daughter in Ohio. There's also a choir director in town, and he dies. There's a milkman in town, and he dies. Everyone dies. Everyone dies all the time. But not in the abstract sense, not in thinking about death in even in similar ways that we're thinking about it, but death orients the perceptions of the characters. Time permeates the imagination that encounters every person that the reader or the audience sees on stage. The reader or the audience cannot avoid the presence of everyone's inevitable and perhaps inconvenient demise. Their lives, as we see them on stage, are rendered vivid by knowing that these characters are already dead. The obvious biological fact of existence prevents our normative evasions. The notion that death is present highlights the perceived insignificance of the most significant moments. In other words, imagine looking at me standing here, listening to me, looking at all the other scholars and professors in the room, looking at everyone else around you, and thinking that every other person you know and you love or you're texting, and you accept that as a natural fact that they all are already dying. It's not living and dead. Everyone constantly is dying. Or, second by second, you are closer to your death than you were a couple seconds ago. We are all always dying, and we all should also know that the soil that will be used to dig our graves is already here. Wilder focuses on what he considers to be universal human experiences. They are simply American families who die. Now, the other significant character is someone I've been alluding to. He's known as the stage manager. The stage manager is both a part of the audience and he's a part of the play. And he's this sort of mysterious communicator between the two. In Act 1, he sets the stage for more than the theatrical performance. He sets the stage for life as such. And what I mean is when you read it says, no curtain, no scenery, what this means is that the certain curtain that's usually there for plays, that's not present, refuses a particular barrier or distinction between actors and audience. That means that the audience becomes a part of the cast, and the cast of the play becomes a part of the audience. Through a sort of biblical lens, or a theological lens, I believe the stage manager functions as like an angel, as a kind of messenger, or a messenger from God, a God figure who is not necessarily omniscient, but more or less in tune with the daily goings and comings of life as such. The stage manager knows about the lives of people who lived in ancient Rome. He knows about the lives of people who lived in ancient Persia. He knows about the lives of people who lived and died and have just accepted that is just the way that the world operates. He functions similar to God in the book of Genesis, Adonai, who's often conflated with angels. If you remember in Genesis, Jacob wrestles with an angel, but declares that he will not let go of this angel until this angel God blesses him. It is a stage manager who represents the sort of angel God-like figure, who's almost disappointed in humanity, and humanity's constant evasions of the fact of their inevitable demise. The meta-theatrical effects of Act 1 are meant to alter how introductory acts of plays normally function. But Act 1 is more than an introduction. It is rather an informative mirror. On one hand, the reader learns about this location, which is Grover's Corner, but on the other hand, such learning, the reader sees a reflection of themselves. Act 2 tells this love story of Emily and George and their impending wedding. Act 3, the central message is a sort of homiletical call meant for people who live on the other side of life and death to accept the fact that life is precious. So I'm going to show a clip of video, and it's going to be kind of dramatic since you're actually not watching the entire play. So this is the sort of part of the play where Emily is in Act 3, and she has died while giving birth to her child. The way that Wilder sets up the play is the people are sitting, kind of like you all are sitting in two separate rows, and there's a wedding. And the next act, there's a break, But those same people on the left side are all people who are now tombstones of themselves. And so Emily marches to a seat and she realizes that she is dead. And she sees all the other people who have passed away before her. And she talks to the stage manager and she's like, you know, I just want to go back one more day. I just want to see them one more time. Can I go back to the land of the living? And the stage manager and every other person who's already passed away says, no, don't do that. They don't understand. Those people on the other side of this life and death binary don't really understand what it's like to feel the weight of time and space, to feel the weight of what it means to actually live. So the stage manager agrees to send her back, but he says under one condition: pick the most insignificant day of your life. Don't pick a birthday, don't pick your wedding day, don't pick the birth of the child before the one that you passed away giving birth to. Pick the least important day of your life and go back to that and see if you can handle it. She goes back. She is like 12 years old and she's trying to give her mom a hug, but her mom is like washing dishes, getting ready for the rest of the day. She tries to get her father to sit down and talk to her, but he's busy. She tries to talk to her brother, but her brother is running around. And she says, I can't do it. These people don't understand what it's like to actually not have life anymore. So she asks the stage manager to accept her back. But before she goes, she makes this sort of monologue. Thank you.
Take me back. Up the hill. To my grave. But first, wait. One more look. Goodbye. Goodbye, world. Goodbye, Grover's Corners. Mama. And Papa. Goodbye to clocks ticking. And my butternut tree. And Mama's sunflowers. And food. And coffee. And new ironed dresses. And hot baths. And sleeping. And waking up. Oh, Earth, you're too wonderful for anyone to realize you. Do any human beings ever realize life while they live it every minute?
No. Saints and poets, maybe, they do so.
I'm ready to go back.
A little dramatic, I know.
Death is.
Our Town is a classic American play. According to theologian David Tracy, every classic lives as a classic only if it finds readers willing to be provoked by its claim to attention. The endurance of Wilder's Our Town is his persistent claim to attention. It is a result of his timeless existential provocation to the living. It provokes or it challenges those who live to live and to cogitate on the temporal dynamism or living itself. It is a sermon beckoning to the living to think deeply about what it means to truly and naturally be historically constituted. Emily visits the living once more, only to become disappointed at noticing how much the living take their lives and their time for granted. Act 3 is where Wilder reinterprets the existentialist traditions, Kierkegaard, Sartre, and Heidegger. For the existentialists, it is a binary between Dasein and non-being, life and death. the ultimate and inevitable non-existence awaiting us all. For Wilder, however, it is not just about the issue of non-being per se. It is the issue of the slow decay to non-being. It is the issue of entropy, of the daily second-by-second transition between life and death, and the consistent denial of death, as Ernest Becker would say. The stage manager highlights this slow decay in his beginning speech in Act 2. He says, 3 years have gone by, the sun's come up over 1,000 times. Summers and winters have cracked the mountains a little bit more than the rains have brought down some of the dirt. Some babies that weren't even born before have begun talking regular sentences. And a number of people who thought they were right and young have noticed that they can't bound up a flight of stairs like they used to without their heart fluttering a little. All that can happen in 1,000 days. Wilder understands that in life there is death. The wedding converts to the funeral. Birthing of a life can convert into a life lost. When Emily requests to transition back to the living, to reverse the decay, she does so with new knowledge and insight that expands the ethic of living and loving in the here and now. Theater scholar Eric Bentley states that death presented a problem in literature in that it is something that neither the author nor his audience has experienced. Death is non-existence, and to speak of comprehending non-existence is to speak of taking hold of a vacuum, end quote. Wilder does not try to comprehend the vacuum as much as he tries to poetically imagine the ontology of the vacuum, the continuity of non-existence, the sheer heartache of being no more. Theater scholar McDonald states that Wilder uses what she calls post-mortem reflection. Continuing, she states that the dead in his play do not find their way to any sort of paradise or fiery pit, but instead are tied to their own corporeal remains and given the option to re-experience any moment of their lives. Wilder's Our Town ultimately asks, what are the stories of the abyss? What tales would the dead recite without ceasing? And through Heidegger, what can they teach us about returning after being thrown? Wilder's play asks the question, what would the dead say if they could communicate their memories of being alive? But let's suppose the dead wouldn't have that many positive things to say. The character Simon Stimson, he's right there in the middle. Simon Stimson functions as the closest example of Thornton Wilder's thoughts on injustice and evil. Simon is the mysterious character in the play. There is no information regarding his background. The play basically reveals that he has a drinking problem, but there's no details about how that drinking problem came to be. The injustice that Simon experiences is that he is ill cared for by the community. When Emily returns to sit down, after you've seen that certain part, he says to Emily after she returns, yes, now you know. That's what it was to be alive, to move about in a cloud of ignorance, to go up and down trampling on the feelings of those about you, to spend and waste time as though you had 1,000,000 years, to always be at the mercy of one self-centered passion or another. Now you know, that's the happy existence you wanted to go back to. Nothing but ignorance and blindness, end quote. For Simon, to live in the world, to be alive, is to be severed from the people that surround you. Life is a journey of selfishness, self-interest, and self-centeredness. Simon's words in many ways mirrors a theologian by the name of Rauschenbusch who critiqued individualistic American Christianity. However, in contrast to Simon Stimson's words, Mrs. Gibbs, her mother-in-law, says, Simon Stimson, that ain't the whole truth of life, and you know it. The whole truth is that there's a section of the human population, small as it might be, these are my words, not hers, end quote. The whole truth is that there's a section of the human population, small as it might be, that strives to help, that endeavors to promote beauty and harmony, social fairness and communal goodness in our social worlds. The whole truth is that there are human beings in the world who might have been here and have passed away, as well as people who are on their way, who spare no effort in attempting to undo the injustice that has historically dominated and undermined the possibilities for living positively in history. The whole truth is that for every form of evil and injustice and carelessness, for every appearance of human devaluation, There is a countering force, be it feeble or strong, that is against it. This lecture argues that in conclusion, Wilder's Our Town is a theatrical sermon that contributes to the small force for goodness. Wilder's desire was for us to value life, value ourselves, and truly value each other. And we can only do that if we do what Emily was so disappointed about, and that is embrace that this life all goes so fast, and we don't have time to look at one another. I find Wilder's play helpful for understanding the sinful or selfish ways we take time and space for granted, the ways that we take life for granted. Wilder's Our Town provides a way of viewing the depth of the inconsiderate use of time, the selfish use of life itself, and overall ignorance regarding our waste of the significance of seconds. Emily in the play realizes how sinful humans are with time, with each other, and before turning to her grave, she says, "I didn't realize. So all that was going on and we never noticed. Oh, Earth, you're too wonderful for anybody to realize you." Thank you.
When I came upon this photograph, I knew I was going to have to, put this talk together. I was obviously kind of nervous about talking about death in such ways. And it's connected to the NPR podcast, Hidden Brain. And the title of the episode for this podcast and this particular moment is "We're All Gonna Die, How Fear of Death Drives Our Behavior." And so when I was talking to a colleague, Professor Millett, and you'll understand this a little, he said, "Oh my gosh, we're all gonna die?" I said, "Yes." And he said, "Oh my gosh, that's what the offensive tackle for the LA Rams said after they lost the Super Bowl." I said, "No kidding, he's very eloquent, because this is the case." And then as I studied this photograph, I thought, oh, this just invokes so many anxieties from the Victorian preoccupation with death, because first of all, it looks like I'm still alive. If I'm looking up at the gravedigger, and there was a tremendous amount of anxiety about whether people were actually dead, so the Victorians, if they could afford it, could set up some really elaborate contraptions with bells and things, so if somebody kind of woke up, the bell would ring, and then the people looking after the cemeteries would come and relieve people from their near interment. So, and of course, it's about the progress of medical science at that point. Somebody being unconscious could look like somebody had in fact died. So there's a way that there's a tremendous amount of anxiety there. So that's the first thing. The next thing is, with regard to a Victorian perspective, that's a very deep grave. And not very many people could afford a grave that deep. And it looks like a grave that's for just one person, but we know from, well, I don't know about you, but I know from various texts and things that only the very wealthy could afford such a single grave, and that mostly people were buried, there were multiple people buried in a single grave. And so I think I was thinking about this because we just finished Oliver Twist in my upper division class, and poor Oliver, he's apprenticed out of the workhouse to an undertaker. And so one of his, well, it's his only experience actually, he goes with Mr. Sowerberry to the grave, and they wait for the gravedigger, who is late, which I'll explain in a minute. But once the gravedigger comes, they kind of tilt the body into the grave, and then the gravedigger jumps into the grave and then pounds down the coffin, because these are multiple coffins kind of lined up, and so the more people you can get into a single grave, the better off the more money you're going to make, actually. So that's kind of the way it works. And then the third point about this photograph is the gravedigger himself. He looks quite, sober. But most gravediggers in the Victorian period were often, lit, if you will. Because you would be too if you had to bury all these bodies, and at various stages of decomposing bodies into a single grave with the bodies piling up. So there was among the social reformers, they just were driven crazy by these, drunken gravediggers. But Henry Mayhew who had a little more common sense about the pressures that people were under, would say, we have to understand this. You too would be drunk if you had to do this all day long. And the cemeteries in London, especially because of the cholera epidemics and really serious illnesses, were filling up quite quickly. So the key social reformers of the moment, namely Edwin Chadwick and then cemetery designer John Claudius Loudon, put their minds to trying to figure out this problem. So if you can't sleep, I will get you a copy of Chadwick's Sanitary Report 1842. And if you're really having further trouble, there's the Supplementary Report 1843 on the state of cemeteries and churchyards in England. So, and then John Claudius Loudon, well, he was actually an amazing designer, landscape designer, but both he and Chadwick, well, Chadwick kind of assumes Loudon in what he's talking about. And the values are key. So go to the little piece here. We'll go to the next. This is a design by John Claudius Loudon of a cemetery. And what it expresses is this middle class desire for, well, as you can see, order. But it's also to take us upward. So you can almost miss the hearse here with the mutes coming along and the attendants. What the diagram or the design is meant to have us look at is, it's like we don't want to dwell too much here, we want to get through the gate, and then we want to climb to the heavens. So there's a way in which our eyes are drawn away from any kind of macabre meditation on death, but it's meant to take us through the chapel gates here and to work our way up to the chapels here, one Anglican and one nonconformist. Because in the 19th century, the Anglican sections were separated from the nonconformist section. So, and then of course, the poor were not included at all, because the poor would be buried in an unmarked grave on the north side of the churchyard, because there's no view, there's no sunshine, and those people kind of deserve that kind of damp, dismal, existence into the next life. The other thing that's interesting here, I think, is the plantings. Loudon's careful to, even with these conical trees, to have the eye move upward, so that we're not gonna dwell too long just yet on these kinds of monuments. But look how tidy they are. They would never be this tidy. But the point is to have us look skyward, look heavenward. And so, Loudon, there are all kinds of these designs that he was working on. Then the other thing that happens, especially on a Sunday afternoon, is the education that takes place at cemeteries. I don't know if you've been to cemeteries, and as you move through and consider the tombstones, there's a way in which it's like there's an appreciation of the life there. But for the middle class, the reformers here, this would be very important for the working classes, to come to these kinds of places and to take this stroll upward through the cemetery. And then in that perusal, they would be looking at these monuments and being educated by the lives of the people who have basically made it. And so there's a kind of history lesson here. There's a very much a moral lesson here with regard to how to live one's life. It's a fascinating ideology, if you will, about how the reformers perceived the reform of the burial problem in England. So there's another 19th century slide here. This is one of my favorites. You can see they're trying to get control of this. This is a cemetery that is not used anymore, but Loudon and Chadwick agrees, we have got to do something about these cemeteries, so let's close them. And then we can create these walks and perambulations, if you will, around the cemetery. And then in that regard, they will be cleaned up, and the kind of sanitary mess that comes from bodies that are not completely buried will be ameliorated. So there's just a tremendous amount of discussion about how to take care of these cemetery problems in the mid part of the 19th century. So what I guess in terms of this talk, I was thinking, I don't want to impose necessarily an arc, because I don't think there is, but as I was thinking about it, you know how you think about things that seem kind of disparate and then an argument appears, and so I just do this lightly. The cemeteries, in a way, clearly are memento mori. I mean, obviously, you could say, well, yes, of course, for the people who are buried there. but it's also for the living who remember or learn something from the people who are buried there. And then, of course, the Victorians moved from this kind of cemetery work. We wouldn't be able to talk about Memento Mori without jewelry. Jewelry that's made from the hair of loved ones. I mean, a lot of it. And this was just a huge industry, if you will, especially with regard to human hair. You know, by the time we get to the 1860s, especially the pre-Raphaelites, they loved hair. They just loved hair. And so they take the hair of their loved ones and make these kinds of rings, jewelry, brooches. The ingenuity is just incredible. So I was thinking, well, that's very interesting because it's a way of, well, Deborah Lutz calls it, she works from a theory called thing theory. It's Bill Brown in 2001 developed this theory that was written up in Critical Inquiry, the depths of which I'm not sure I understand, but most fundamentally, this thing theory is being applied to the Victorian era in lots of different ways because the Victorian era was just full of stuff. And so literary critics are looking at the role of things with a little bit more of a critical eye. But in general terms, thing theory means that the hair of the person, for example, is no longer the hair of the person. So what happens is then the hair is sort of repurposed, and what was once a thing becomes then an object, and the object then has meaning for the people who wear the jewelry or carry the jewelry or sort of live and embody memento mori all the time. So, and this would be true. I mean, mourning practices in the Victorian era were comprehensive. I mean, 2 years of wearing black. And I mean, if you were of a certain status, 2 years of wearing black, and then the move to lavender and gray for the next several years. So it's like Gillian's pin there. She has a great, yes, it's a kind of memento mori that is that you carry these objects that are repurposed in order to continue to be connected and related to the loved one. And then this is a really famous brooch. I mean, hair, again, would be wound here to be worn as a brooch for women on a lapel or suit. It's a tremendous industry. It's probably the most famous brooch with hair is William Morris's hair. Kind of looks like his wallpaper, It's like very floral. The other thing then is I think about this kind of arc, if you will. If we move from the cemetery to the grave markers to the jewelry, and then we move to the daguerreotype, the photography, and the scenes in which loved ones are photographed with their recently died. And actually, Derek, you did some work on this a while ago? Yeah, the daguerreotype. So it's, again, at first kind of unnerving, and I guess I should have said there's some unnerving things here because these are people who have died. But you can see that the emotion is so beautiful and intense, if you will, almost to a certain point where you think, well, this is the mother who has died, but just kind of just sleeping, and the father here with the son, and then the mother here who's living, and this is a kind of a typical thing. Sometimes you can see the red appear on her cheeks to indicate that she's alive, but sometimes they put the red on the cheeks of the person who has died. So this became very popular, especially with the development of photography. I came upon, and actually it was something like this that kind of got me thinking about this project in the first place. I came across at the University of Chicago bookstore an American Heritage that had photographs of these children, mostly with their parents, the children who had died. And then I lived with somebody who worked at Rush Presbyterian, and she came home one day and she said, "Guess what?" And I was like, "What?" And she said it was her first experience that a baby had died at birth, and so the staff at Rush Presbyterian asked the parents, "Would you like to be photographed with your child?" And so that's what happened. They at the hospital, and the ministers at the hospital set up the scene for the parents to be photographed with the child. And it's not often, I didn't include it here, but a couple of weeks ago there was I have to back up here. The joke is that if you're from Omaha, you're either watching the Weather Channel or reading the obituaries. And so I was the other day reading the obituaries, and there was a beautiful picture of this baby boy who had died. And that, for the obituary, I thought that's very unusual to see actually the picture of the child who had died. But I think it's an extension of this tradition. And then there was also another article in the New York Times, but I couldn't find it, in which actually people whose child had been born without life, if you will, they were taking videos. So there was a kind of video memento mori for those children and for the family, so as a way to remember them. So this is quite striking. I just offer just this brief example. And then finally, well, not quite finally, but this person's name is Alfreda Longtong from the Sulawesi region in Indonesia. And in the West, we pretty much demarcate pretty clearly the lines between life and death. As I was listening to that podcast about We're All Gonna Die, I thought, of course, about the Immaculata. And I always appreciate the fact that there are funerals there, because I think it's kind of part of the education of students, although one time I did teach a course and had students go to funerals, but I don't know, it's just kind of interesting to watch students walk by with a certain amount of respect. But the other thing that the podcast says is that our behavior in the face of death or the fear of death changes. So I don't know about you, but when those funeral reserved parking signs go up, it's like, hey, that's my parking place. It's like, oh boy. So how quickly we sort of come around to our own small worlds, but I think in a way that's the beauty of death, is it's meant to call us out of ourselves. So this person she's not dead according to the Indonesian culture. She's sick. And she's been sick for about 12 years. And in the course of this time, and I love these little kids, visiting grandmother, they provide 3 meals a day. They visit with the person, they talk with the person, and then at the end of the day, the oldest relative comes in and covers her with a lace shawl and then closes the lid, and then the next day they come back to visit. This is set up this way so that there's a tremendous significance given to the size of the funeral. So for the funeral to take place according to the dignity that the family wants to extend to the person, they have to raise quite a bit of money to buy cattle in order to feed the crowds. And in this interview, the person said, well, do you mind tourists coming? No, the more the merrier, because that says that our person is highly dignified, and besides it helps our economy, because people come and they spend money. And so there's this whole kind of economic transaction that takes place. But I think that what I love about it is that these categories of life and death can bleed away, if you will. And it's the education of the next generation to appreciate that the person in a way hasn't gone. So, and then finally, there is a company in Washington State called Recompose. And I don't know if you've heard about this or seen articles about it, but basically its endeavor is it has an eco-friendly mix of things to advance the decomposition of the body, and that decomposition, once finished, it turns into composting material. So instead of cremains, we have compost that people then can use in their gardens and for their trees. Then there's a sense in which literally death gives life, I guess. And then there was a comment, they interviewed people. This is kind of a place where people can come and visit their loved ones while they're being composted, if you will. They can come and visit. I just love it. Look how light and airy it is. And one woman in an interview said, I really enjoy or love talking about death because it deepens my life. So I'll leave it there. Thank you.
I love your description of our town. It was wonderful. But when you were talking about it, I couldn't help but think about contrasting with Hamlet.
Okay.
And Hamlet looks at the skull, and that was kind of a very important moment of contemplation. But the problem was he was misled into reflecting on death and how it reflects back in life, but he was looking at the decisive moment rather than the ordinary moment. I just like the way our town focuses on the ordinary moment is what life actually is, rather than the decisive moment. Because the ordinary moment, in a way, is sort of like related to contemplation, right? Whereas decisive moment is like action. That doesn't mean you should act in the world, but act in a more ordinary way rather than a sort of like a dramatic way. And he and Hamlet ended up killing everybody. Because he focused on the wrong thing.
Yeah, I think for me that's why it was so important to highlight insignificance, because Hamlet would count as a tragedy. I wouldn't count Our Town as a tragedy. Like, it's not a tragic play because there's nothing heroic, there's nothing necessarily eventful, there's no one that is more unique or peculiar or special in comparison to the rest of the characters or even from the audience perspective. And so it not being a tragedy and being more closely aligned with the comedy, this is just a common thing that happens in life. Like the only reason we have a term known as life is because there's something called death. Right? The only reason we have something called death is because there's something called life. And so to focus on what is unique and special in the most unassuming things, to me, it's a phenomenal achievement, I think. It's one of my favorite plays in the world, even though it's gone out of style a bit. I know it was like in the 80s and 70s, every high school played. So mostly adults know what Our Town is. You know, after you get to, people born in the 90s, it's like, I don't know what you're talking about. But I think that's a good thing to pick up on.
I think looking at past eras and past human cultures, whether it be these old European cultures or the Victorian cultures, or even more like modern 20th century, it seems like a balance between embracing death and kind of fearing death, which I think we kind of have as a society now today. Is it fair to say that humans in these eras dealt with death similarly to us today?
Are you asking, well, I think the Victorians, they celebrated death. I mean, because it was so kind of persistent and imminent right before them. And at the same time, I think underneath your question is a very good point, and that is, even as I was working on these slides, we always have to be paying attention to the historical particulars, of a particular culture, particular moment in time, in order to kind of appreciate what's happening. So in the mid part of the 19th century, for example, there's this concern about cleaning up the graveyards, and the sanitary movement was well underway. By the time we get to the end of the 19th century, people are beginning to talk about cremation and the arguments about cremation because of this sense that they have a different understanding of the body. And one of my favorite arguments about cremation is that people said, well, my goodness, what about the integrity of the body? I mean, we want to be buried facing the east, so when the second coming comes, when we sit upright, we'll be facing east. And so if you just have ashes, how's that going to work? And the answer is, well, God can do anything. So God will reconstitute us so that we can then transcend into the next life. But that was a concern given scientific development at the end of the 19th century with regard to the crematoria and the technology involved there, and then the theological arguments about the resurrection of the body. That's a whole element. So I think you have to, I'll speak for myself, I always have to be careful about those particular historical moments that's unique to each culture. So the Indonesian culture is something very different. Because the Victorians, they did keep bodies in the homes, especially people who couldn't afford the burial. And so actually that's the beginning of insurance, the burial societies in England. So they did keep the bodies in the home. And from the middle class reformers' point of view, it's like way too long. So it kind of depends on where you're
positioned in the culture. Yeah.
So like I'm a lot younger than most people in this room. So I think, well, like in my friend group, or like maybe a generalization of like my generation, quote unquote, we've like learned to accept death, that like we are gonna die a lot more, and like we talk about it a lot more, but what we're scared of is like when and how. And I think that tied into like how we are so scared that we're living such an insignificant life because we are fed by like either pop culture or media or stories that we need to live like a life of remembrance, or like a lot of things like during orientation week has been like, what legacy do you want to leave at University of San Diego when you graduate? So like we're pressured with like we need to live like a life of like accomplishments and like heroic actions, and we don't really have time to like just live in the moment and like reflect on how we want to like just live our lives, like day-to-day actions.
It's a great point. I think that, you know, when we're dealing with questions of, you know, what makes our lives significant, that's always, you know, the undercurrent of anything in Memento Mori is what have you thought about in terms of your life? But to try to take some of that pressure off, that, you know, there's a lot of beauty in being in the moment and being in the ordinary, right? And celebrating that, just, you know, hanging out with your friends and enjoying the food that you're eating for dinner and all of those sorts of things. And, you know, which is exactly what Dr. Calloway was saying about it always comes back to that, always comes back to, you know, the moment that we have that we don't notice at the time.
Questions? Oh, there's Susie, a question of somebody else. It's, you know, you were showing that picture of Paul Clay's, I think, Death and Fire.
Yeah.
It seemed like a spiritual painting.
Yeah.
Because fire was delight is something with the four elements.
Yeah.
So it seems to me it's not so much about, you know, what cremation is about. Spirit continues in some levels.
Yeah. Which makes it kind of hopeful. So that juxtaposition of death and hope, or death and life, which is what everyone's been talking about. So yeah, definitely.
Oh, I was just going to say the third presenter is
Mary.
So the slide with the jewelry
Mm-hmm.
we were talking about, and how we were just like, ooh, it kind of gave us like.
Did it give you the willies?
Interesting. One of my best friends lost her daughter at 19 years old in April, and some of these mementos, I guess you could say, are coming back. Women are actually taking their breast milk, putting it in jewelry. But what I thought was really neat is that my friend Ashley took her breast milk, but also put her baby who passed, her hair in a ring.
Yeah.
So some of these things that might like give us like, ooh, like there's a lot of beauty in it as well. So I just thought that was interesting that like, the Victorian era had that, but some of these things are coming back. And if you go on Instagram, like they can take hair and put it in jewelry, and it looks quite beautiful.
Yeah. Oh, gosh, yes.
So I just thought that was really interesting.
Yes, I think so. You know, for some, you know, as you say, we're kind of off-put initially, but what I'm just discovering what you're talking about too is that it's very hard you can't legislate how people will remember their loved ones.
Yeah.
You know,
Grief is everyone's gonna take it differently, and you know, she mentions a lot to me that a lot of people are so off-put and so awkward around her.
Yeah.
And but you know, it's part of our lives, and what she wants more than anything is for people to like see the beauty in it and remember her daughter.
Yeah.
She's died and we can't talk about it. So
yes. Yeah, and that's with grief and mourning, that's a whole other kind of very interesting dynamic. But I think what the woman says in this Recompose video that I saw, that's exactly what she was saying. Being able to talk about these things and being able to connect with people along these lines has a way of deepening their experience of relationships, both with the person who has died, but with each other. It's about community.
She finds great comfort in, we did the Japanese, what's it called?
The Oban.
Festival, like I took her there, and then also Dia de Muertos, that, and she's gonna have like she actually had like a 2-year celebration at her daughter's gravesite, and just like, you know, kind of embracing it and trying to like get people to see like it's not just like sadness too, it's also like celebrating her life, and she wasn't here for very long.
Yeah, and it has a way of then qualifying our lives, which means it's very dynamic.
I have just one thing about
You get the last word.
Way to go, Fred. Yeah.
about our town. And you just touched on it, but the thing that balances out so much of the sadness of our town, for me, in the end, is that the people who die are still conscious.
Yeah.
They're telling you, don't go back, don't look and everything, but they're all sitting there chatting with each other.
Yeah.
You know, they're sitting in seats, you know, like they're in an audience.
Yeah.
And they're talking to each other.
Yeah.
And so the idea that consciousness survives the death of the body is just really interesting to me.
Yeah.
And balances that, keeps that from being, you know, a tragedy.
Yeah.
It's a consciousness that, because before Emily arrives, we know that they are quiet. They're silently waiting for something. Wilder has some mysterious eschatology that he doesn't really map out in the play or in any of the other works. But it also touches on the sort of consciousness that's a part of like Western Christendom, where we say things like, when I pass away, I'll be reconciled with my loved ones. That's a consciousness that's still present, even in like Western Christian theology, Catholic and Protestant and Orthodox. But the thing about consciousness that I think Wilder outlines even probably more so than our own particular Christian eschatologies is that Wilder is honest about the pain and grief that still exists within a person's conscience. So if I say that heaven is this place of joy, of nothing but bliss, then how can I still possess a consciousness? Because a part of my love for the loved one that I will be reconciled to or with, it also embraces the moments of pain and hurt. There's no such thing as loving someone unless they've hurt you, because how will you know if you've forgiven them? How will you know if you've gotten past things? Like it includes conflict. If I have no memory of that, then I have no memory of the person. So even with consciousness, I think Wilder is at least honest about the fact that consciousness includes conflict and maybe even a desire to never return. Versus Western Christianity, which says that heaven is a state of bliss and consciousness simultaneously in ways that we haven't quite reconciled.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you.